With the election quickly approaching, in today's video, we are going to compare and contrast the suggested policies from both presidential candidates to understand how they will impact retirees. I'm a certified financial planner, and I'm the owner of an independent financial planning firm. And every year, I spend hundreds of hours helping retirees avoid the stress of new policies or legislation by building secure retirement plans. Now, it can be difficult to know if you're prepared for retirement even at the best of times. Never mind in the middle of what appears to be a hectic election period where it feels like every day there's another news article on Social Security or inflation. Well, not to worry. By the end of this video, you'll be able to walk away knowing the policies from both sides and how you can avoid election risk. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it. There are three primary areas that retirees are financially affected by policy. The first is Social Security, the second is taxes, and the third is inflation. Now I'm going to go through each of these broad categories one by one, highlighting each candidate's policy proposals. And then after outlining the policy proposal, I'm going to show a series of spreadsheets that show the estimated financial impact of each candidate's policy proposals, one against the other. And then at the end of this video, I'm going to provide my summarizing thoughts about how this upcoming election may influence your retirement plans. Let's begin with each candidate's policies as they relate to Social Security benefits. Now, at this point, the Harris campaign has not suggested anything that directly relates to Social Security. The Trump campaign, however, has proposed exempting all Social Security income from taxes. Now, as it currently stands, up to 85% of Social Security benefits are already taxed. And there's a lot of hubbub about whether Social Security benefits should or should not be taxed, but the truth is kind of complicated. See, Social Security benefits can best be thought of as a non-qualified annuity. In simpler terms, what that really just means is the original contributions are done using after-tax dollars, but the growth on those contributions have not been taxed. And in fact, research shows that only about 15% of contributions to Social Security have been taxed, meaning that about 85% of what a retiree will receive is actually growth. So a strong case could be made that Social Security benefits should be taxed to some degree. Now, I'm not saying that I personally agree with that. I'm only saying that the case can be made. Now, how Social Security benefits are taxed currently is a notoriously complicated formula that I'm not going to share in this video. What I will share, however, is what is the expected net effect to you as a retiree on your spendable dollars of exempting Social Security from income taxes. You can see this data on the screen here comes from the Tax Foundation, and there's this complicated chart, but the Tax Foundation has the following summary to say about this chart. The proposed income tax exemption would increase after-tax incomes of retirees by about 0.6 percentage points on average in 2025 onwards, ranging from no change for the bottom 20% of taxpayers to as high as a 1.1% increase for those in the 80th and 90th percentiles of income. The bottom 20% would see no benefit from the proposal on a conventional basis, as they are already in the 0% tax bracket for benefits under current law. However, higher earners would see a larger benefit, which tapers off for the top 10% of earners, as benefits make up a smaller share of their total after-tax income. Now, in the long run, on a dynamic basis, all income groups would see a slight increase in after-tax incomes, averaging about 0.9%. So in summary, this proposal would increase a retiree's spendable income by a teeny tiny amount, less than 1% across all income brackets. On the flip side, it does reduce the amount of tax revenue collected by the government, which could potentially contribute further to the Social Security Trust Fund insolvency issue. Now, this is one of those policy issues that may sound good via soundbite, but really does not have a material effect on you, the retiree, as a consumer. And so let's move on to the second, more substantive category of policy proposals, the tax proposals. Now, as you know, taxes will be your largest expense in retirement. And both candidates actually have a pretty beefy set of proposals that will have impacts on retirees' retirements. The question, once again, is going to be, are they material and should we be afraid of them? Let's begin with Trump's proposal. That is to make the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent. So in order to review this, I'm going to pop a series of spreadsheets on the screen so that we can go through the items that would be relevant to retirees, you guys, specifically. The first and most obvious area of impact would be on income tax rates. So now on the screen here is a crazy chart with many moving parts, but basically what it does is it illustrates the comparison between the pre-Tax Cuts and Jobs Act's tax brackets to the post Tax Cuts and Jobs Acts, tax brackets. That was very hard to say. Let me bring your attention to a few key points to reduce any feelings of nausea that you may have as you look at this chart here. So the first and most obvious impact is that the top marginal tax bracket would be reduced from 39.6% here where my mouse is to 37% here where my mouse now is, a 2.6% decrease in top tax bracket. Now, this will not impact the bulk of retirees. So a far more impactful measure to the bulk of retirees are going to be these blue and yellow rows here. Prior to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the second, third, fourth, and fifth tax brackets would have been 15, 25, 28, and 33% respectively. And you can see that in this column here labeled tax rate. Now, after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, all of those tax brackets were lowered. The 15% bracket became 12, the 25% bracket became 22, the 28% bracket became 24, and the 33% bracket becomes 32%. It looks pretty good. But what is not clear on the surface is that under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, some of the brackets were expanded or widened so that the actual net tax effect, while for sure a win, is not as substantial as it may appear. So for example, if you were a married couple and were to fall beneath $77,400 in taxable income, which would have kept you beneath the 25% bracket, but in maxing out the 15% bracket, both as a married filer in both the pre-Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and post-Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And let's say you were to make $77,399, just right beneath the upper limit, that Tax Cuts and Job tax change would save you about $1,750 in taxes each year. That would be a tax savings of roughly 2.26%. Now, if you were a married couple and made $156,000 roughly, effectively hitting the tippy top of the prior 28% bracket, under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, you would have saved an additional $2,300 in taxes each year on top. So another roughly 1.5% for a cumulative total of something like 3.75% tax savings. Now, for a final example, say you had the household income of $700,000. You hit the top federal tax bracket and you want to compare the difference in tax that would have been paid before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act to after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Well, that total tax savings would have been $22,965, which you can see right here, resulting in a 3.28% total tax savings. Now, the tax savings from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act does not actually end here. The TCJA also has a substantial impact by increasing the standard deduction across the board. And the standard deduction is a deduction that reduces your taxable income each year in retirement that every household obtains just by being a household. Now, this spreadsheet here on the screen shows the increase in that standard deduction, as well as the effect in tax savings. So before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, a single filer standard deduction was $6,500. After the legislation, the single filer received a standard deduction of $12,000. And you can see that the pre-tax here and the post-Tax Cuts and Jobs Act here. It's an almost double the size of the standard deduction. And then this green column here called difference shows the tax savings that would result based on which marginal tax bracket you fell into. You can see that the more you would have made, the more you would have saved. And the tax savings ranges from $550 to as high as $1,866 per year for this single filer. Now, for the married couple, which you can now see below, the pre-Tax Cuts and Jobs Act standard deduction was $13,000. After the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, it was $24,000. So again, almost double. And the tax savings range over here in the green column from $1,100 to as high as $3,732 per year. So on net, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act does have a material tax saving effect across the board. Now, the Harris-Walz campaign has suggested their own slew of tax policies and tax policy suggestions as well that will have a tax impact. The first item that they suggest, which is on this list here, does not have clarity at this moment. It's not clearly defined, but the Harris-Walz campaign is proposing to expand the premium tax credits that provide Affordable Care Act subsidies for private health insurance. From what we know currently, they want to bring back what are called ARPA changes that were made back in 2021 during COVID that expanded the pool of potential candidates for these healthcare subsidies to households that made more than the 400% of the federal poverty limit restriction. Now, this would effectively make credits and subsidies for private health insurance available to a larger total pool of households that obtain healthcare on the private market. So if you were to retire before Medicare age and need to explore private healthcare options, this potential policy would be a practical benefit to you if you could strategically keep your taxable income below whatever threshold the Harris-Walz campaign would put into effect should this policy get passed. Then the Harris-Walz campaign have 3 proposals for tax increases that affect high-income and high-net-worth households. The first is a proposal to increase the top capital gains rate to 28% for households with taxable income above $1 million. Let's tab over to a spreadsheet that will show the summary for this. Now, this would affect a rather small cohort of the population, but effectively it would increase taxes on long-term capital gains above that $1 million threshold by $8,000 per additional $100,000 of income. And I see this affecting retiree households that have large taxable accounts with large unrealized gains, where that household may want to make portfolio adjustments to diversify large concentrated positions or to reduce risk after many years of potentially ignoring or avoiding rebalancing. But admittedly, this will affect a small proportion of retirees. The second tax proposal is to increase the net investment income tax to 5% for households with over $400,000 of investment income. And this would be an increase of 1.2% from the current rate of 3.8%. And again, not entirely clear at this point how this might take effect, but for households with income from interest, dividends, capital gains, rents and royalties, and non-qualified annuities, where that totals above $400,000, each additional $100,000 of income would incur an additional tax of $1,200, this green cell here. The third and most impactful of the tax increases is a proposal to increase the additional Medicare tax from 0.9% to 5% on incomes above $400,000. And this would specifically affect wages, salaries, self-employment income, but would not apply to income items that are included in net investment income. And you can see on the screen here that for each additional $100,000 of income above that $400,000 threshold, there would be an additional tax of $4,100 per $100,000 of extra income. So on net, the Harris-Walz proposals would cause taxes to go up for higher income, higher wealth retirees. But these tax increases would affect a relatively small proportion of retirees. So now let's move to the third item that policy proposals have a large impact on, which is inflation. Now, this is a trickier category to nail down. Each candidate does have policy proposals that could affect inflation, but there are also unspoken behaviors that each candidate may have that could affect inflation, specifically how they choose to execute government spending and what they plan to do regarding running budget deficits while in office. So let's start with each of their policy suggestions first. These are much harder to calculate hard numbers for, but we can use basic economic principles to give us guidance as to what the directional effect of each might be. So starting with Trump's proposals, Trump is proposing a 10% tariff across the board for all US imports, as well as 60% tariff on all imports from China. Now, from a purely economics perspective, this will increase prices to consumers, people just like you. Now, either in the form of more expensive goods that are produced inside the US, or because we're going to have to pay the additional cost of the tariff for any imports that come from outside the US. Now, on the Harris-Walz side, they are proposing a $25,000 credit to first-time home buyers. And this would effectively lead to increased home prices, as this increases demand for homes because it brings more buyers to the market who otherwise would not have participated in the home purchase market. Now, because most retirees own their own homes, this could actually have a positive wealth effect on retirees, but overall, this will likely have an inflationary effect elsewhere in the economy. Now, much more likely to affect inflation are both candidates' actual decisions as they relate to government debt and spending deficits. And for this, we have another summary table here that shows a comparison president by president as it relates to government spending during their term in office. For the last 30 years, government debt has increased substantially, and the tolerance for budget deficits has ramped up as well. Now, during the first Trump presidency, despite saying he would rein in spending, the national debt ballooned by an estimated $5.6 trillion. And while admittedly Kamala Harris is not the president currently, under the Biden-Harris presidency, government debt is projected to increase by an estimated $7.2 trillion in total by the end of the term. Now, I have no judgments about which is better or worse. In fact, both candidates appear really to be the same to me. They may say that tackling the budget deficit is a concern, but the behaviors do not substantiate that. And ultimately, as I show you this summary table here, I recommend choosing to believe your eyes more than your ears. And as you can see here, over the last 30 years, according to public data from the US government itself, inflation has been roughly 3.04%. But inflation has actually been ramping up. As you can see, it was at roughly 2.94% in the 90s. It went down to 2.35% during the 2000s. That was largely because of deflationary effects as a result of the dot-com bust and the great financial crisis during that decade. And then inflation has accelerated in the last publicly available 10 years to 3.7%. Now, my opinion is that this ramping up of inflation is likely to continue as asset markets, meaning housing and investments, continue to increase in value, which is just another form of inflation. Now, the question is, should this scare us? So to answer that question, I'm going to add this third row or third column here to the summary table, which shows the investment performance of a 60-40 portfolio, the most common retirement portfolio, over those same 10-year time periods. Because ultimately what really matters is the relationship or the spread between investment growth rates and the increase in cost of living over that same time period. As long as we have a healthy spread between those two, retirees who have been diligent savers and rely on their investment portfolios to support spending needs will be okay in retirement. Now, as you can see from this spreadsheet here, from this final column, growth rates have vastly exceeded the rate of cost of living, the growth rate of cost of living over each 10-year time period shown on the screen here, as well as over the 30-year average. Now, having said all this, the final question is, do we think that this healthy spread that I've just talked about is likely to continue? Well, I don't really have a crystal ball, and I can't provide a definitive answer to that. But since we are comparing the two presidential candidates and what their effects might be on a retiree's retirement plan, we can take a look at this final summary table here, which shows a comparison of the S&P 500 performance between the two candidates' different terms. Now, as you can see, that performance has been nearly identical. During the first Trump presidency, the S&P 500 had an annualized return of 15.9%, with a maximum drawdown of just under 20%. During the first 45 months of the Biden-Harris presidency, again, Kamala Harris was not the president, but we'll use this data, the S&P 500 has had a 13.67% annualized return, and it's possible and maybe even likely that we could see that increase to match or even exceed the annualized return during the Trump presidency. The Biden-Harris presidency saw a slightly worse max drawdown of just under 24%, but not super different than that of the Trump presidency. Now, if we just ignore the nameplates, turn the nameplates of these presidents off and ignore which candidates were in office over the past 8 years, the past 8 years were some of the best consecutive market returns in history, with an 8-year annualized return of 14.84%, which you can see here, and a maximum drawdown of under 24%. Now, will that continue? I don't know. But what I do believe is that running huge government deficits causes an inflationary effect on both consumer prices, but also asset prices, meaning investments in houses. And as long as asset price inflation and wage growth outpace consumer price inflation, retirees will be okay in the end. So far, that has actually been the story, which I illustrated in a video I did a couple weeks ago showing that both wages and investment portfolio growth have significantly exceeded consumer price increases. So to wind things to a conclusion here, my takeaway as a professional retirement planner and wealth manager is that which candidate ends up in office will likely have a relatively similar effect on you, retirees. Yes, each candidate proposes policy that will affect a different segment of the population, and each candidate proposes policy that will have different downstream results as well. But if we focus on the things that produce the most stability for retirees, spending behaviors, and risk management strategies for investment portfolios, you could likely close your eyes, ignore which candidate ends up in office, and the end result of your financial success in retirement will most likely be the same. Now that you know what could be in store in the near future, you can start to prepare for your retirement regardless of the outcome. And when it comes to how to prepare, there are details that I obviously haven't been able to break down in detail in this video. So if you want to learn more, you can click the link in the description to this video to watch a completely free video on building out the ideal retirement plan. Thank you as always for your time and attention, and I will look forward to seeing you in the next video.